So as you can see here, we also have access to Amara's skill tree with this new leak, of which Amara's skill tree is very different than Zane's. Zane can have 2 abilities at the same time, but Amara can only have 1, as well as 1 augment ability and also 1 elemental ability. So going through Amara's skill tree, it's broken up into 3 branches like every skill tree ever. The first one is Brawl, of which the first ability is Phase Slam. Amara leaps into the air and slams the ground, dealing damage to all nearby enemies and knocking them up. Next skill is One with Nature. Amara gains increased max health and elemental damage resistance to her action skill element. Next of which is Personal Space. Amara's weapon shots deal bonus damage based on the distance to her target. The closer the target, the greater the bonus. Next ability is Clarity. Amara constantly regenerates health. The lower her health, the more powerful the regeneration. After using an action skill, this bonus is doubled for a few seconds. Next skill is Arms Deal. Amara deals increased splash damage and takes reduced splash damage. Next is Root to Rise. Amara gains increased max health. Skill after that is Helping Hands. For a few seconds after using her action skill, Amara's arms remain active and grant her damage reduction. Next is the first elemental ability, Blight Tiger. Converts Amara's action skill to corrosive damage. This does not take effect until after Amara uses her action skill. Next is another ability. Amara summons a handful of fists that erupt from the ground, dealing damage to enemies in front of Amara. Our next skill is Mindfulness. Whenever Amara takes damage, she gains a stack of Mindfulness. For every stack of Mindfulness, Amara gains improved shield regen delay and movement speed. Stacks decay after a few seconds. And the next skill is Find Your Center. Amara gains increased melee damage. Additionally, for a few seconds after using her action skill, Amara gains increased melee range. And next is Vigor. Killing an enemy with Amara's action skill grants all allies increased movement speed for a few seconds. This effect stacks. This is the first effect, Revelation. Amara's action skill now creates a Nova when it damages enemies, dealing damage to all nearby enemies. And the next action is Downfall. Amara leaps into the air and shoots an elemental beam below her briefly, followed by a slam. And the next skill is Samsara. When Amara deals damage to an enemy with her action skill, she adds a stack of Samsara. For every stack of Samsara, Amara gains increased gun damage and health regen for a few seconds. Stacks decay after a few seconds. Going down further the tree, we have the next skill, Do Unto Others. Whenever an enemy damages Amara, she automatically throws an energy orb back at them, dealing action skill elemental damage. This skill has a short cooldown. And our next skill is Jab Cross. Whenever Amara deals melee damage to an enemy, she gains increased action skill damage and increased weapon damage for a few seconds. Next up, we have Guardian Angel. When Amara enters Fight for Your Life, she immediately gains a second wind, restores her health, and creates an action skill elemental Nova that knocks back nearby enemies. This skill has a long cooldown. Next, we have another effect, Glamour. Enemies damaged by Amara's action skill become confused and temporarily attack their allies. However, action skill cooldown is increased. If Amara targets an enemy with Phase Grasp, enemies near the grasp target are confused as well. And finally, we have our capstone, which is Blitz. Melee Override. Press the melee button to make Amara dash a short distance forward and perform a special melee strike, dealing elemental melee damage. If a Blitz melee attack kills an enemy, Blitz's cooldown is immediately reset. And on to our second tree is Mythical Assault, of which the first action is Phase Cast. Amara sends forward an astral projection of herself, dealing damage to everything in its path. And our first skill here is Do Harm. Killing an enemy grants Amara a stack of Rush. Activating her action skill consumes all Rush stacks. For every stack of Rush consumed, Amara's action skill damage is temporarily increased. Next skill is Fast Hands. Amara's reload speed, weapon swap speed, and mode swap speed are improved. And our next skill is Violent Tapestry. Applying an elemental effect grants Amara a stack of Rush. Activating her action skill consumes all Rush stacks. For every stack of Rush consumed, Amara's elemental effect chance is temporarily increased. Alacrity. Amara gains increased reload speed for every stack of Rush. After consuming Rush stacks, this bonus is increased for a few seconds. And next we have Transcend. Amara gains increased accuracy and critical hit bonus for a few seconds after activating her action skill. Next skill is Restless. Amara gains increased action skill cooldown rate. And the next effect is Soul Sap. A portion of all damage dealt by Amara's action skill is returned to her or a nearby ally as health. And our next ability is Reverberation. Amara sends forward an astral projection of herself, dealing damage to everything in its path. Astral projection deals increased damage for every enemy it hits. And the next skill is Ascendant. All action skill augments gain increased effects. And our next effect is Stiffness of the Mind. Enemies damaged by Amara's action skill become phase locked until they are damaged or the duration ends. However, action skill cooldown is increased. If Amara targets an enemy with phase grasp, enemies near the grasp target are phase locked. And our next ability is Deliverance. Amara sends forward an astral projection of herself, dealing damage to everything in its path. Whenever Amara's astral projection hits an enemy, it releases homing elemental projectiles that trigger her action skill elemental effect on enemies. Next up we have From Rest. Amara gains improved fire rate and charge time. Next skill is Laid Boar. Enemies take increased damage from all sources for a few seconds after being damaged by Amara's action skill. Next skill is Wrath. Amara gains increased gun damage. This effect is increased after she activates her action skill for a few seconds. Going further down the tree, we have Remnant. When Amara kills an enemy with a gun or action skill, she creates a homing projectile that seeks out a new enemy, dealing her action skill element damage. Any overkill damage is added to the projectile's damage. Our next skill is Awakening. Amara's rush stacks gain increased effectiveness. We have another ability, which is Tandava. Amara sends forward an astral projection of herself. Whenever it hits a target, it explodes, damaging all nearby enemies. And finally, our skill cap is Avatar. Amara's action skill can be activated while it's cooling down. This skill may only be used once per completed cooldown. Additionally, it increases Amara's max rush stacks. And our third and final tree is Fist of the Elements, with the first ability being Phase Grasp. Amara summons a giant fist that bursts from the ground and locks the targeted enemy in place for a few seconds. Some enemies are immune to being grasped and instantly take damage instead. Our first skill is Anima. Amara's elemental effects deal increased damage over time and have increased duration. Her action skill elemental effect deals further increased damage. Next skill up is Steady Hands. Amara gains increased weapon handling and accuracy. Skill after that is Infusion. Convert a portion of damage dealt by Amara's weapons into her action skill element. Our next skill is Tempest. Amara deals increased elemental damage. Shock damage is further increased. Our next skill is Illuminated Fist. Amara gains increased melee damage, and her melee damage is converted to her action skill element. Up next is Wildfire. Whenever Amara applies an elemental effect to an enemy, it has a chance to spread to a nearby enemy. And here we have our next element, which is Soulfire. Converts Amara's action skill to fire damage. This does not take effect until after Amara uses her action skill. And our next ability is the Eternal Fist. Amara summons a giant fist that bursts from the ground and locks the targeted enemy in place for a few seconds. Whenever the grasped enemy is killed, up to 3 new targets can be sought out and grasped. Our next skill is Dread. Amara's gun damage is increased for a few seconds after an enemy is grasped. Whenever any player kills a grasped enemy, their current weapon is instantly reloaded. And our next effect is Allure. Amara's action skill creates singularities that pull in enemies. Our next skill is Indiscriminate. Amara's bullets that damage enemies have a chance to ricochet and deal decreased damage to other nearby enemies. Ricochet chance and damage are increased if the target is currently affected by Phase Grasp or Stillness of the Mind. Our next skill is Deep Well. Amara gains increased magazine size with elemental weapons. Up next is Catharsis. Whenever Amara targets an elemental effect on an enemy, when that enemy dies, the enemy explodes, dealing her attuned element damage along with any other element that is currently inflicted upon that enemy. This skill has a short cooldown. Now we have our next ability, which is Ties That Bind. Amara summons a giant fist that bursts from the ground and locks the targeted enemy in place for a few seconds. Enemies near the grasped target are linked, and any damage dealt to a linked target is shared between all other linked targets. Going further down the list, we have our next ability, which is Fist Over Matter. Amara summons a giant fist that bursts from the ground and locks the targeted enemy in place for a few seconds. After grasping the targeted enemy, large fists appear and consistently smash the area, dealing damage to nearby enemies. Next skill is Sustainment. Amara gains lifesteal whenever she deals elemental damage with her weapon. Our next skill is Can Flux. Whenever Amara applies an elemental effect to an enemy, she gains a chance to randomly electrocute, burn, or melt that enemy. And finally, our last skill is Forceful Expression. Amara's guns deal bonus elemental damage based on her action skill element. And that one completely caps off Amara's whole skill tree. That wraps this whole video up. Remember to dislike, unsub, have your identity stolen by some Epic Games hacker, and I will not see you in the next one.